Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 48, The American Civil War, Part 5. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the characters on the stage of the American Civil War. I generally find history to be formulaic, almost like a math equation. If A happens, while B also happens, then C will be the outcome. This is a comical worldview for anyone that truly knows me, as I greatly disdain all things math related. The people and the places are almost interchangeable for me. What ultimately drives the story, narrative, or however you wish to view the past and its events and places, not so much the individual. I will admit that this is almost a too simplistic view and most likely deeply flawed logic. My only rational defense is, in the words of the great animated philosopher of the 20th century, Popeye the Sailor Man, I am what I am, and that's what I am. This all being said, credit needs to be given where credit is due. The larger-than-life cast of players, movers and shakers, and the like during the war are significantly examined within the realm of academia and our textbooks. Historians have steered books and, in some instances, their entire careers in the service of retelling and analyzing Civil War generals. This interests me less than most because I look at the more significant concepts to answer why, instead of fine-combing everything mundane detail like forensic scientists. You could say I see the forest, not the trees kind of historian. I wish not to be overwhelmed by detail to the point where it obscures the overall situation. But let us not do a great disservice to you. Without a doubt, there are tales to be told from some serious heavy hitters like Robert E. Lee to William T. Sherman. Make sure to bring your microscope for this investigation. Robert E. Lee. Born to Revolutionary War hero Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee in Stratford Hall, Virginia, Robert Edward Lee seemed fated for military distinction. Despite financial trouble that caused his father to depart to the West Indies, young Robert ensured an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he graduated second in his class in 1829. 2 years later, he married Mary Anna Randolph Custis, a descendant of George Washington's adopted son, John Parke Custis. Yet, with all his military pedigree, Lee had not set foot on a battlefield. Instead, he served 17 years as an officer in the Corps of Engineers, managing and examining the construction of the nation's coastal defenses. Service during the 1846 War with Mexico, however, changed that. As a member of General Winfield Scott's staff, Lee distinguished himself, emerging from the conflict with the rank of colonel. From 1852 to 1855, Lee served as superintendent of West Point and was therefore accountable for educating many of the men he would later serve under him, and those who would fight against him on the battlefield of the Civil War. In 1855, he left the academy to take a position in the cavalry and, in 1859, was called upon to put down abolitionist John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry. Because of his prominence as one of the best officers in the United States Army, Abraham Lincoln offered Lee control of the federal forces on April 1861. Lee rejected the offer and quit the Army when the state of Virginia seceded on April 17, arguing that he could not fight against his people. Instead, he accepted a general's commission in the newly formed Confederate Army. His first military engagement of the Civil War occurred at Cheat Mountain on September 11, 1861. It was a Union victory, but Lee's stature withstood the public objection. He served as military advisor to President Jefferson Davis until June 1862, when he was given command of the wounded General Joseph E. Johnston's embattled army at the Virginia Peninsula. Lee renamed his command the Army of Northern Virginia, and under his direction it would become the most famous and successful of the Confederate armies. This organization also boasted some of the Confederacy's most inspiring, or dare I say, villainous military figures, including James Longstreet, Stonewall Jackson, and the flashy Cavalier J.E.B. Stuart. With these trusted associates, Lee commanded troops that often beat their blue-clad adversaries and embarrassed their generals, no matter the odds. Yet despite foiling several attempts to seize the Confederate capital, Lee recognized that the key to ultimate success was a victory on northern soil. In September 1862, he launched an invasion into Maryland with the hope of shifting the war's focus away from Virginia. But when a misplaced dispatch outlining the invasion plan was discovered by Union Commander George McClellan, the element of surprise was lost, and the two armies faced off at the Battle of Antietam. Though his plans were no longer a secret, Lee nevertheless managed to fight McClellan to a stalemate on September 17, 1862. Following the bloodiest one-day battle of the war, heavy casualties compelled Lee to withdraw under cover of night. The remainder of 1862 was spent on the defensive, parrying Union trusts at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville in May of the following year. The skillful victory of Chancellorsville gave Lee great confidence in his army, and the rebel chief was again inspired to take the fight to enemy soil. In later June 1863, he began another invasion of the North, meeting the Union host at the crossroads town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For 3 days, Lee assailed the Federal Army under George G. Meade in what would become the most famous battle of the entire war. Familiarized with seeing the Yankees run into the face of his aggressive troops, Lee attacked strong Union positions on high grounds. But this time, the Federals would not budge. The Confederate war effort reached its high water mark on July 3, 1863, when Lee ordered a massive frontal assault against Meade's center, spearheaded by Virginians under Major General George E. Pickett. The attack known as Pickett's Charge was a failure, and Lee, realizing that the South lost the battle, ordered his army to retreat. Taking full blame for the defeat, he wrote Jefferson Davis offering his resignation, which Davis refused to accept. After the accompanying Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, Mississippi, Ulysses S. Grant took command of the Federal armies. Rather than making Richmond the aim of his campaign, Grant focused the various resources of his disposal on destroying Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The Federal juggernaut bludgeoned the undersupplied rebel band in a tenacious and bloody campaign. Despite his ability to make Grant pay in blood for his bold tactics, Lee had been forced to yield the initiative to his opponent. He recognized that the end of the Confederacy was only a matter of time. By the summer of 1864, the Confederates had been forced into waging trench warfare outside of Petersburg. Though President Davis named the Virginian General-in-Chief of all Confederate forces in February 1865, only 2 months later, on April 9, 1865, Lee was forced to surrender his tired and exhausted army to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. Lee returned home on parole and ultimately became the president of Washington College of Virginia. He remained in this position until his death on October 12, 1870, in Lexington, Virginia. Ulysses S. Grant. Born Hiram Ulysses Grant in Point Pleasant, Ohio, his name changed due to a clerical error during his first days at the United States Military Academy at West Point. To his friends, however, he was just known simply as Sam. After a middling term as a cadet, he graduated 21st out of 39 cadets in the class of 1843. Yet despite his less than exemplary school record, he served well as a captain during the Mexican War, winning 2 citations for gallantry and 1 for meritorious conduct. Only when the fighting stopped and Grant was assigned tedious tasks at remote posts far from his wife and family did he again begin ignoring his work and drinking heavily. He resigned in 1854 to avoid being removed from the service. Grant spent the next 6 years in St. Louis, Missouri with his wife, Julia Dent Grant. After several short-lived pursuits, including a brief episode as a farmer, he moved to Galena, Illinois, to be a clerk in his family's store. When the Civil War began in 1861, he jumped at the chance to volunteer for military service in the Union Army. His first command was as the colonel of the 21st Illinois Infantry. Still, he was quickly boosted to brigadier general in July 1861 and was given control of the district of southeast Missouri in September. His 1862 victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in western Tennessee won him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant and placed him before the public eye. Yet, when a surprise attack by Confederate forces at the Battle of Shiloh rendered devastating casualties during the first days of fighting, President Abraham Lincoln received several requests for Grant's removal from command. However, Lincoln declined, stating, "I can't spare this man. He fights." The following day, Grant's army, bolstered by troops under Major General Don Carlos Buell, fended off Confederate advances and ultimately won the day. Grant's hard-won victory at Vicksburg, Mississippi in May 1863 was a strategic masterwork. On May 1, 1863, Grant's army crossed the Mississippi River at the Battle of Port Gibson. With Confederate forces unclear of his intentions, Grant sent a portion of his army under General William T. Sherman to capture the state capital, Jackson, while setting his sights on Vicksburg to permanently close the Confederate supply base. When initial assaults on the city showed the strength of Vicksburg's defense, the Union Army was forced to lay siege to the town. On July 4, 1863, after 46 days of digging trenches and lobbing hand grenades, Confederate General John Pemberton's 30,000-man army surrendered. Coupled with the northern victory at Gettysburg, the capture of Vicksburg marked the turning point in the war. It also made Grant the premier commander in the Federal Army. Later that same year, officials called Grant upon to break the stalemate at Chattanooga, further cementing his reputation as a capable and effective leader. In March 1864, President Lincoln elevated Grant to the rank of lieutenant general and named him general-in-chief of the armies of the United States. Making his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, Grant was determined to destroy Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia at any cost. Though plagued by unwilling subordinates, petty disputes between generals, and horrendous casualties, the Union forces smacked down Lee from the Rapidan River to James in what one player would later call or describe as, quote, unspoken, unspeakable history. The battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and the following siege of Petersburg effectively obliterated the rebel army, leading to the fall of Richmond and Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Though Grant's forces had been depleted by more than half during the last year of the war, Lee surrendered in 1865. After the Civil War, President Andrew Johnson named Grant Secretary of War over the newly reunited nation. In 1868, running against Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant was elected the 18th President of the United States. Unfortunately, though innocent of graft himself, Grant's administration was riddled with corruption and scandal. For 2 years following his second term in office, Grant made a triumphal tour of the world. In 1884, he lost his whole savings to a corrupt bank. To make some of his losses, he wrote about his war adventures for Century magazine. They proved so popular that he was inspired to write his remarkable autobiography, Personal Memoirs of U.S. Grant. He finished the 2-volume set only a few days before dying of cancer at 63. Ulysses S. Grant is buried in New York City in the largest mausoleum of its kind in the United States. Grant's tomb is a national memorial reminiscent of Napoleon's tomb in Paris. George B. McClellan. George McClellan is one of those generals who looks great on paper. McClellan was a great organizer, a West Point trained engineer who did much to build the Union Army almost from scratch. His work as an observer during the Crimean War gave him insight into the significance of logistics for an industrialized army. Years spent as the chief of engineering for the Illinois Central Railroad made him aware of the transformative nature of rail transport. Little Mac would be a fantastic organizer who kept his army well supplied, efficiently run, and satisfied. He was also quite gifted at overvaluing the size of his opponent's armies. He was too conservative by nature. Despite Lincoln's plea for aggressive action, his Army of the Potomac moved hesitantly. Its commander McClellan persuaded himself that the Southern armies sizably outnumbered him when logic should have told him that it was the North that enjoyed a surplus of resources. Men and material the Union could provide its armies, but there was something that not even New York and Chicago factories could produce, and that was time. As Lincoln knew, the only way that the Union could lose the war is if the North eventually grew tired and agreed to allow the South to secede. Haste risked casualties and defeats at the hands of a tough opponent like Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia. The alternative was to split the United States apart. Because he never wanted to face a superior force, he refused to fight. This is a troubling quality when one's title as General-in-Chief of the entire Union Army. After months of inaction, McClellan was finally provoked to action by President Abraham Lincoln. In the early stages of the conflict, troops under McClellan scored several vital victories in the struggle for Western Virginia. Lincoln summoned young Napoleon, as some call the general, to Washington, D.C. to take control of the Army of the Potomac a few days after its humiliating defeat at the Battle of the First Bull Run, Virginia, in July 1861. Over the next 9 months, McClellan capably built a strong army, drilling his troops and making an efficient command structure. However, he also showed extreme disdain for the president and often ignored Lincoln's suggestions. McClellan staged an amazing amphibious landing of more than 100,000 troops at Fort Monroe at the southeast end of the peninsula between the James and York Rivers. In stereotypical McClellan fashion, he was promptly checked by a vastly inferior force under John Bankhead Magruder. Although he outnumbered Magruder's army in the peninsula 10-1, McClellan settled in for a month-long siege. By the end of May 1862, Confederate commanding General Joseph E. Johnston had withdrawn his forces to Richmond, and McClellan was close enough to the Confederate capital to hear its church bells ringing. Johnston was wounded on the first day of the Battle of Seven Pines, 6 miles east of Richmond, and Robert E. Lee replaced him. Lee immediately caught McClellan's demeanor, and during the 7 days battle, Lee drove back the Union armies from Richmond's doorstep. Lincoln relieved McClellan, but reinstated him after the devastating Union defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Once again, McClellan worked his administrative magic, reviving the morale of a shattered Union army. And once again, at the Battle of Antietam, McClellan's terminal case of the slows, as Lincoln called it, stopped the exploitation of possible war-ending exposure and Confederate defenses. On September 17, 1862, McClellan and Lee battled to a halt along Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland. Lee retreated to Virginia, and McClellan dismissed Lincoln's surging to pursue him. Lincoln and McClellan exchanged angry messages for 6 weeks, but McClellan stubbornly declined to march after Lee. In late October, McClellan finally began moving across the Potomac in feeble pursuit of Lee, but it took 9 days to complete the crossing. Lincoln had seen enough. Convinced that McClellan could never defeat Lee, Lincoln informed the general on November 5th of his removal. A few days later, Lincoln named General Ambrose Burnside to be the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Ulysses S. Grant, who replaced McClellan, comprehended this. He gritted his teeth and wore down the Confederacy with constant attacks until the South could take no more. McClellan was a proto-Douglas MacArthur who badmouthed his president and commander-in-chief. Grant left politics to the politicians and did what had to be done. After his removal, McClellan fought with Lincoln again for the presidency in 1864. He ran as a Democrat against Lincoln in the election. That year, a key plank of the Democratic platform was not fighting, and McClellan lost in a rout.
George William Flagg. It might not seem like it to some, but the American Civil War greatly impacted the development of the sport of wrestling. Army camps were full of men anxious to fight, and many brought their disciplines. Styles from Ireland, England, Scotland, and Germany were brought over and clashed and mixed. Men like George Flagg honed their skills in these camps and left the army as top-notch wrestlers. Flagg was born in Braintree on April 9, 1839. George Flagg was a farm boy from central Vermont. Educated in the common schools of Braintree and Randolph Academy, he stayed upon his father's farm till the age of 20 and afterward was a day laborer till the breaking out of the Civil War. He became the champion of Champlain Valley before joining the 2nd Vermont Volunteer Infantry Regiment. While serving in the Union Army, Flagg became the champion of the Army of Potomac. He was at the Siege of Petersburg and Richmond, and the surrender of Lee at Appomattox on April 9, 1865. He partook in the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 and served under McClellan in the campaign before Richmond in the summer of 1862. He was also at Antietam, at the First and Second Battle of Fredericksburg, at Gettysburg, and in the three of the Shenandoah Valley, Winchester, Fisher's Hill, and Cedar Creek. Early in life, he showed great aptitude for collar and elbow wrestling. He gradually so increased in skill that he was the acknowledged champion of the Army. From the age of 35 to 48, he traveled extensively in most northern states, giving exhibitions of his proficiency. It is said for 15 years. He knew no difference in men. He could throw any man he ever met in 5 minutes. He traveled through western New York, where he won many matches, also Ohio. He wrestled in almost every town of importance in Michigan. In New England, he wrestled for agricultural societies, one of which was the Vermont State Fair, also on July 4th gatherings to thousands of people under great excitement. He challenged all comers for any amount with perfect confidence in his travels. Athletic sports had a great passion for him. During Flagg's wrestling career, he certainly wrestled 200 matches. He met and defeated noted wrestlers. Shot in the left hand, Flagg was permanently injured but returned to his regiment and mustered out as a first lieutenant. Flagg resumed his career as a wrestler, and in his era, Flagg faced and defeated the likes of H.M. Dufour and Duncan Ross. Flagg also met but was bested by fellow Civil War veteran Colonel James McClellan. After the war, Flagg settled into a quiet life, and assumed his wrestling days were over. But it was not so to be. An ambitious wrestler at Northfield challenged all comers, and Flagg was persuaded to meet him. He found the Northfield man a mere boy in his hands. After this, invitations and challenges to wrestle came to him from all parts of the country, and his fame spread. He wrestled in almost all the large towns of Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. He made a 3-month wrestling tour of the last-named state when he was 48. He also met H.M. Dufour, who Flagg says was the first and only man he ever met with whom he could not win a match at will. Flagg and Dufour traveled together for some time, giving exhibitions of strength and skill. At Bethel, where 12 of the best wrestlers ever seen in a town in the United States gathered, Flagg won the champion belt after a 3-day contest. Soon after the close of the war, he married and settled upon a farm. After each campaign of travels, he returned to work on his farm, never training for a match or series of games. Concurrent to his post-war wrestling exploits, Flagg became a successful breeder, landholder, and local politician. As a Republican, Flagg was called upon to serve his town in many minor offices and was elected representative to the legislature in 1886. Flagg was very zealous for temperance, never tasting liquor and advocating the cause of temperance through speeches and daily living. He never tasted liquor in all his travels, making speeches in the legislature on the grounds of temperance, never tiring in advocating its cause. He continued to wrestle into his 60s, although his record did not make him one of the elite wrestlers of his day. Flagg's last appearance was at Manchester, New Hampshire, at the dedication of the new gymnasium when he was 62 years old.
Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was born on April 5, 1839, behind his owner's house in Beaufort, South Carolina. Lydia's mother served in the place but grew up in the fields, where she was taken from her own family on the Sea Islands at 9. What is clear is that the owners, the McKee family, favored Robert Smalls over the other slave children, so much so that his mother worried he would reach manhood without seizing the horrors of the society into which he was born. She organized for him to be sent into the fields to work and watch enslaved people at the whipping post to familiarize him. This lesson led Robert to defy. He often found himself in the Beaufort jail. If anything, Small's mother's plan had worked too well, so worrying for her son's safety, she asked McKee to allow Smalls to go to Charleston to be rented out to work. By the time Smalls turned 19, he had tried his hand at several city jobs and was allowed to keep $1 of his weekly wages. Far more valuable was his education on the water. Few knew Charleston Harbor better than Robert Smalls. To white Confederates, the Union ships blockading their harbors were another example of the North's control of the South. To enslaved people like Robert Smalls, these ships signaled the tantalizing promise of freedom. Under orders from Secretary Gideon Welles in Washington, Navy commanders have been taking runaways as contraband since September. While Smalls couldn't afford to buy his family on shore, he knew he could win their freedom by the sea, so he told his wife to be ready whenever the opportunity dawned. In April 1861, the American Civil War began with the Battle of Fort Sumter near Charleston Harbor. In the fall of 1861, Smalls was appointed to steer the CSS Planter, a lightly armed Confederate military transport under the command of Charleston's District Commander Brigadier General Roswell S. Ripley. Planter's duties were observing waterways, laying mines, and delivering dispatches, troops, and supplies. Smalls steered the Planter throughout Charleston Harbor and beyond, on area rivers, and along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coasts. Smalls and the Planter's crew could see the line of Federal blockade ships in the outer harbor, 7 miles away from Charleston Harbor. Smalls seemed pleased and had the confidence of the Planter's crew and owners, and at some time in April 1862, Smalls began to plan an escape. He conferred the matter with all the other enslaved people in the crew except one, whom he did not trust. On May 12, 1862, the Planter traveled 10 miles southwest of Charleston to stop at Coles Island, a Confederate post on the Stono River that was disassembled. The ship picked up 4 large guns to transport to a fort in Charleston Harbor. The crew loaded 200 pounds of ammunition and firewood back in Charleston onto the Planter. On May 12, the Planter was docked at the pier below General Ripley's headquarters. Its 3 white officers disembarked to spend the night ashore, leaving Smalls and the crew on board, as was their custom. Before the officers left, Smalls asked Captain Relier if the crew's families could visit, which was occasionally allowed, and be authorized on the condition that they leave before curfew. When the families arrived, the men revealed the plan to them. At some point, 3 crew members acted as if to escort family members back home but pivoted and hid aboard another steamer docked at the North Atlantic Wharf. At about 3 a.m. on May 13, Smalls and 7 of the 8 enslaved crew members made their previously planned escape to the Union blockade ships. Smalls put on the captain's uniform and wore a straw hat similar to the captain's. He sailed the Planter past what was then called Southern Wharf and stopped at another pier to pick up his wife and children and the families of other crewmen. The Planter sailed past Fort Sumter at about 4:30 a.m. Captain Charles C.J. Relier had commanded the Planter, and Smalls copied Relier's manners and straw hat on deck to fool Confederate observers from shore and the forts. Smalls guided the ship past the 5 Confederate harbor forts without incident as he gave the correct signals at checkpoints. As the nearly free enslaved people approached Fort Sumter, their apprehension grew. It was the most heavily armed of the forts and tended to be manned by the most questionable soldiers. As the Planter approached the fort, several men urged Smalls to give it a wide berth. Smalls refused, saying that such behavior would almost certainly arouse suspicion. He slowly steered the ship along its typical path as though he were merely enjoying the early morning air in no particular hurry. When Fort Sumter flashed the challenge signal, Smalls again gave the correct hand signs. There was a long pause. The fort didn't immediately respond, and Smalls now expected cannon fire to shred the Planter at any moment. Finally, the fort signaled that all was well, and Smalls sailed his ship out of the harbor. Officials only raised the alarm after the ship was beyond gun range. Rather than turn east towards Morris Island, Smalls had headed straight for the Union Navy fleet, replacing the rebel flags with a white bed sheet that his wife brought. The Planter had been seen by the USS Onward, which was about to fire until a crewman spotted the white flag. The sheet was difficult to see in the dark, but the sunrise arrived, which allowed viewing. The Onward's captain, John Frederick Nichols, boarded the Planter, and Smalls asked for a United States flag to display. He surrendered the Planter and its cargo to the United States Navy. Smalls' escape plan had succeeded. Following the war, Smalls continued to push the boundaries of freedom as a first-generation black politician, serving in the South Carolina State Assembly and Senate, and for 5 non-consecutive terms in the U.S. House of Representatives before watching his state roll back Reconstruction in a revised 1895 Constitution that stripped blacks of their voting rights.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show is produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.